animal agriculture accounts for 20% of all greenhouse gas emissions. Look at kind of what the potential reduction in greenhouse gas emissions looks like for alternative proteins. If we look at something like plant-based meat, so again, that Impossible Burger, that can cause up to 98% fewer emissions than animal meat, use up to 93% less land, and 99% less water.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the CleanTechies Podcast. This is episode 71 of the show. I'm your host Silas Maynor and thank you for joining us on today's episode. Before we get into the details, a note for any founders listening and then a bit for from our sponsors. If you are a founder in the space seeking funding or looking for partnerships, please consider reaching out as we are always doing our best to introduce founders to the capital providers that we are aware of and that we have relationships with. And we also often make introductions to potential partnership opportunities for many of our guests. So feel free to reach out for either of those things. And thank you, as always, to NextWave Partners for sponsoring this show and making it possible. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you are looking to make a career change yourself, please consider reaching out to NextWave. You can reach them at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. And additionally, NextWave has also recently offered to do free consultations with anyone affected by the recent layoffs in tech who are seeking to get into the climate tech space. So if that describes you, please do consider reaching out to their consultants as well. So with that, let's get into the episode details. Today we are joined by Sharyn Murray from Good Food Institute, and they are commonly referred to as GFI, so we'll use that going forward. And in this episode, we speak about a lot of different things, but in order to keep the intro short, we'll just mention the key topics. And those are essentially what GFI does as a whole, what are alternative proteins. This is kind of the theme of the show overall, really kind of centers around this idea of alternative proteins and that topic. And then we also discuss how alternative proteins are made. This was a really great segment, in my opinion, because Sharyn was able to really kind of demystify the process of producing these alternative meats. Turns out it's not a bunch of scientists in white coats mixing and matching potions in a lab. It's actually relatively straightforward. So I thought that was really helpful for somebody like myself to understand. Not sure if anybody else will relate with that. I hope it is helpful. And then additionally, we spoke about the missing infrastructure in the space and how GFI is helping close that gap through their grant program. So really, overall, very incredible episode, packed full of great insights. Sharyn did a really good job of breaking things down. So without any further delay, we present you our discussion with Sharyn Murray. All right, welcome to the show, Sharyn. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really, really excited to have this conversation. So I guess let's just get right into things. Could you give us a quick kind of summary about yourself, maybe some of your major accomplishments, and ultimately want to understand how you ended up getting into the space?
Yeah, absolutely. I was not worried about this major accomplishment question, so I'll do my best. But perhaps just for a quick bio here. So I studied economics and psychology at Northwestern University outside of Chicago, and then did what my immigrant parents wanted me to do, which was get a financially stable job. So I joined the investment management industry, did a range of things, but primarily hedge fund research, and just was happily doing that, doing what I thought I had to do for quite some time. And then maybe 5 years or so into that role, post college, realized I was earning more money than I needed. I was renting a 1-bedroom, didn't have a car, thank you to Chicago Public Transit, and wanted to start donating my excess compensation, but making sure it was actually doing good in the world, kind of putting that investment hat on. And through doing research on this, I discovered Effective Altruism, which is essentially a movement that is focused on using evidence and data to try to do the most good possible, given that we all have limited resources, whether that is money or time. So it's a philosophy that can be applied to donations, as well as how we use our careers. In fact, there is a website called 80,000 Hours for anybody who has some of these questions and wants to think about doing good with their career. So once I discovered Effective Altruism, I started applying that to my own career thinking, and based on analysis, decided to continue working in investment management for the time being and donating my excess income. I took the Giving What We Can pledge, which is also a pretty interesting community for those interested. After some time, though, I got to the point in my career where I felt that I had built, some skills, hopefully a network that would be helpful in moving into a more mission-driven career. And with that began a search during the pandemic, I think like many people, and discovered the Good Food Institute, where I am now, and Alternative Proteins as a really wonderful supply side, markets-driven solution to many climate challenges, as well as issues for public health, food security, and animal welfare. And then, applied and joined, and was very lucky to be welcomed in.
Mm-hmm. I'm kind of curious to ask a little bit, this wasn't in the show notes or anything, but curious to understand the decision-making process from when you decided, hey, I've built something, I've got a skill set, I want to make a change. Was that kind of tugging at you earlier and it just took you a while to realize it? Could you talk a little bit about that for people who are, I think there's a lot of people probably who are interested in making an impact, but are trying to balance the kind of debate of whether I should stay where I am, probably keep making a lot more money than if I go to a more purpose-driven role. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, it absolutely was tugging at me, and I tried to make the analytical decision on, where I was maybe only 5 years out of college and what value I could provide to a mission-driven career. And I didn't see a very clear path at the time. And so it felt, more realistic to do more good through donation, especially to effective causes. There's a book called actually I need to look up the name of this, so I will come back to you in a moment. But Doing Good Better, I think, by Will McGaskill. I'll have to look up the name and we can maybe have it in the show notes. But this really provided a good framework for thinking about this. So I'll give a few more thoughts, but I definitely recommend people take a look. And it is Doing Good Better. I just double checked. So the idea there is really thinking counterfactually. So, if I were to join some kind of more mission-driven organization, would my incremental value to that organization be higher than kind of the next best person versus perhaps the value I can give through donations or, volunteering my time, whatever it might be. It's not a perfect decision-making rubric because we just don't have all the data to go in there, but it helped provide a backdrop. And the reason I decided to make the shift and what I'd recommend to people is, keep an eye out for what roles are out there in areas that really speak to you, and then really pay attention on if you think you really are like an incrementally strong candidate for that role. And so in my situation, there's a lot of roles where I just had transferable skill sets and, maybe would have done just fine in those, but maybe not much better than the next best person. For GFI, in my specific role, it was to build out the investor engagement function at GFI. So that's a pretty rare opportunity, I think, as an investor to go into the NGO nonprofit world and have a network and a background and kind of knowledge set that was perhaps different than other candidates that would apply for that type of a role.
Mm-hmm. So in essence, to try to summarize that and make sure I got that all correct, you focus on opportunities where you would probably stand out essentially from the other candidates, given your background, and kind of thinking about yourself as, hey, of the candidates applying, I should be somebody who's probably a bit different, because not a lot of people, perhaps are willing to take the pay cut or whatever might have come with it. Is that correct?
Yeah. I think that specifically for investment to nonprofit is probably a big thing people think about.
Yeah, I think, obviously in my day job, I see this a lot where hire managers will just shoot down a candidate because they assume they're not willing to make the pay cut. It's like, no, I've already screened them on that. So that's really helpful. I appreciate that. And I think a lot of people will probably benefit from that thought process. Could you, I guess now I'd like to just have you give us a quick summary of what GFI does as a whole, for people who aren't familiar, just kind of breaking down the key elements.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are an international nonprofit that is dedicated to reimagining meat production as well as production of other proteins. We were founded 7 years ago with the idea to support a supply side solution to all of the challenges of industrial animal agriculture that was just not sustainable. And the idea here is that, there are groups, doctors, environmentalists that have begged people to eat less meat for a very long time. And yet, per capita meat consumption keeps reaching new highs. In developed economies, we just continue to increase our meat consumption. In emerging economies, they're not eating enough protein. And so as their wealth increases, that is something they're consuming more, and is very understandable. Now, because begging people to change their habits doesn't work, the idea was to provide a solution in alternative proteins, essentially making the meat, eggs, and dairies that people love, but in a better, more sustainable way, and then easing that transition for them. So this is very similar to the theory of change for something like renewable energy, right? We can't ask people to just stop using energy, but we can provide them with a more sustainable and efficient solution. And so alternative proteins is doing the same thing. GFI does our work internationally. So we're in the US, but also in Europe, in Asia, Israel, Brazil, India, with a growing team. And we're really working across the public and private sector. So we have a policy team that is lobbying governments to increase open access research funding, which we think is a really key lever, as well as support infrastructure build out. So again, really following some of the roadmaps laid out by renewable energy, decades ago, solar in particular. They're also helping governments understand cultivated meat as a new food, and there's some exciting regulatory news there that I think we'll get into. We've got a science technology team. These are PhDs who are conducting research, really looking at white spaces, trying to identify bottlenecks, build up the talent pipeline in this space. That's really important for this kind of nascent industry. And then we also have a grant-making program where we ourselves fund open access research. And then finally, we have a corporate engagement team. That's where I sit. And here we work with the private sector. So everyone from early stage startups or entrepreneurs just thinking through an idea to the large CPG companies, meat companies, ingredient companies who are all getting involved in the space, retailers, food service, and then investors, which is my role. And perhaps the last thing I'll say there is, everything we do is funded by donors. So we're very lucky in that way, by foundations and individuals. And that allows us to publish all of our resources in an open access format and provide all of our services free of charge, which just lets us have a whole lot more impact than if we operated like a typical consultant.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So did you mind also elaborating a little bit on the impetus to found it? Who was instrumental in making this happen? Could you talk a little bit about that? I think it would be interesting for people to be aware.
Yeah, absolutely. So Bruce Friedrich is our founder. He actually has an excellent TED Talk with several million viewers. So definitely point folks that way, and perhaps we can share that link as a follow-up. He used to be at Mercy for Animals, which was one of the nonprofits that was trying to drive change in animal agriculture, but by influencing corporates to drive change in the way that they're, in animal welfare and other considerations. He and some others at Mercy realized that, as I noted, this just wasn't working, at least not working fast enough to drive the change that we need to see. And following the theory of change that I laid out, decided to launch a new initiative focused on this. As I said, just 7 years ago, and now we've got over 170 people globally, so it's grown quite ccly. Bruce just became our global president, so he's overseeing our work across the world. And then we were lucky to have Ilya Shayman join as our CEO in the US.
Mm-hmm. Very nice. I appreciate that background. I think it's always interesting to hear how these things come about. I've actually quite recently, probably perhaps because we've spoken not too long ago, started to notice a bit more about GFI in the news and some of the things that they've actually helped to kind of push for and help achieve. So I think it's quite fascinating. Before we get into it, for people who are not familiar, which may be a lot of people, could you help us define the difference between the various different types of alternative proteins so people are familiar with the terminology here?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for providing that opportunity to level set, because there are always so many different terms for everything, and helpful to all be on the same page. When we talk about alternative proteins, we're really talking about three categories, which are plant-based, fermentation-enabled, and cultivated meat. So plant-based, I suspect the audience will be quite familiar with. This is everything from an Impossible Burger to oat milk. We're essentially using plants as building blocks to biomimic animal-based meat, eggs, and dairy. So make it as close as possible, but using, again, a more sustainable production method and healthier production method. Fermentation is something that's been used in food product for millennia, right? It's what we use to make beer and brew alcohol, to make kimchi, to make tempeh. So the idea in its use in alternative proteins is to evolve this use to, again, make meat, eggs, and dairy. And there are two exciting ways that that's happening. So one is biomass fermentation. This is where we're identifying microorganisms, so like a fungi, for example, that itself has really high protein content and grows really quickly. And we're essentially growing that biomass, growing that protein, and then using that as an ingredient to make something that looks very similar to what one would eat plant-based. This has actually been on the market since the 1980s. I'm just not sure anyone's aware. So there's a company called Quorn out of the UK. It's Quorn, and they've been making mycoprotein in this way, again, since I think 1985. But I think it's just been viewed as part of the plant-based category, and in a lot of ways, it's not that dissimilar, but it does have some quite interesting, unique kind of nutritional characteristics and production capabilities. And there are more and more companies who are cropping up that are using a range of, again, fungi or other microorganisms in this way. There's also precision fermentation. So this is something that also is not new to the food industry, but it's new to be used in this way. So precision fermentation is essentially when you, again, find microorganisms, say something like a yeast, and you program it, or you find ones that are already creating a specific molecule that you want. So this has been used, for example, to create insulin that used to be derived from a pig. For a long time, pharmaceuticals have been creating insulin using precision fermentation. I noted it's been used in food. So rennet, which is a set of enzymes that turns milk into cheese, the vast majority of that is created using precision fermentation. So the approach here is to use that again to create some really high value ingredients. So for example, there are companies creating real dairy whey and casein, so the two main proteins in dairy. And then that can be used to mix, say, with plant-based products to create a really nice ice cream. Brave Robot ice cream is actually on the market for anyone who wants to try it. Milk, cheese, and more. It can help boost what can't be done perhaps as well with plants alone. And then we've got this third category, cultivated meat. This is essentially biologically identical meat to what you'd find in animal meat, but grown outside of the animal. So what happens, you essentially take a small biopsy from an animal and establish a cell line, and you don't have to keep going back to the animal once you establish that cell line. You can then feed the cells in a big steel tank. So think something like what's at your local brewery. You feed it various nutrients that it needs to grow. It grows, you potentially have it differentiate into muscle and fat if you want both, and then you harvest that and then can turn it into your burger or your steak. So this is a pretty new technology, but it's been worked on since at least 2013 and quite a few developments in recent years.
And could you speak just very briefly to the three of those and kind of the, I guess, production capacity to make it kind of more on industrial scale? Is, I would assume the latter is the closest to that, but could you speak a little bit to the production process there?
Yeah, absolutely. So plant-based is actually the one that is kind of the most mature technology with the most products on the market. So if we look at plant-based milk, for example, in the US, that's actually 16% of plant-based, or excuse me, of milk sales are plant-based milk. So that's kind of the furthest along. Plant-based meat is closer to 1 to 2% of retail sales, but that's still far beyond if we look at something like fermentation or cultivated meat, where fermentation, with the exception of corn, is quite new to the market. There are a few other products out there, like I noted, Brave Robot ice cream, but it's still quite small today, but it's ramping up quickly. And biomass fermentation in particular likely can evolve more quickly in precision fermentation, which is a higher tech, kind of more expensive category. Cultivated meat is fully new as is being applied to food. It's been used in the medical research field for a long time, but because of that, it takes a lot longer to build up that capacity, get that CapEx there. So very little is being sold on the market today. That's partially regulatory as well. It's been sold in Singapore. The US is moving towards being able to sell. We just had the FDA provide a green light for Upside Food, one of the leading companies, on their cultivated chicken products. So, they're likely going to come to market first in the US. We're getting there, But so far, really, it's been negligible in terms of what consumers can actually purchase today.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I do think it's interesting because you have to essentially bring a product that's first of all good enough, and then try to get it through regulation before you can start selling. It's a tough one. A lot of barriers, but I guess I do want to speak about that. Could you speak kind of broadly about what have been the obstacles to get more adoption here, whether that be regulation or consumer kind of outlook on it or things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's maybe start with the consumers, right? Because the whole theory of change here is giving consumers an alternative that for them is as good as or better than what they're currently eating. And so if we look at, consumer studies that show how consumers make their decisions, things like health, curiosity, increasingly climate, tend to bring consumers into something like a plant-based products. And I'm speaking to plant-based because that, as I noted, is mostly what's been on the market to date. But what gets them to stay is taste and price. And so the biggest kind of undercurrent to all of our work is supporting the industry in getting, these products tasting as good or better than their conventional animal counterparts and costing the same or less. To get there, we need to fund innovation, right? So investors can make a big difference here, as can governments. A number of products have arguably achieved taste parity or close to it, but some have not. And so that, leads to some risk on the consumer side if they try a random product and it happens to not be one of the better ones out there, that can be an issue. So I think generally getting the quality of products, the average quality, again, at, parity or better than conventional meat is step number one. And then, step number two is price, especially in the current environment we're seeing today with inflation. Consumers are paying attention. And so they really need a reason to pay more for that premium product. And that's difficult. So getting that price down is going to be a really big step as well. Luckily, there are a few products that have reached price parity, but certainly we're not there across the board. Then we need to get manufacturing capacity up, as we just talked to. So, depending on which product we're talking about or which part of the value chain, there are different costs associated, but generally we can think of, tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars for CapEx requirements for a commercial scale facility. And that just takes time. This whole industry has seen, something like 13 billion of investment to date, which is very small when we think about what needs to be built over time. So that all takes time. And then of course that also feeds into getting the price down because we are in in the food industry. And then finally, regulatory. So this is not so much of a challenge for plant-based or fermentation. There are, on the fermentation side, new products, new ingredients might need to go through the GRAS process in the US, generally accepted as safe. But that's been done for a long time for food and is not unique to alternative proteins. Cultivated meat is really where the regulatory barrier has been to date because it is a new food type, and government agencies like the FDA, USDA, have been working for years now to develop a process to bring these foods to market safely, because of course that is everybody's first priority. As I noted earlier, Singapore was the first country to approve a cultivated meat product. That happened at the end of 2020. And then just last week, the US FDA, for the very first time, as I alluded to, gave this green light on cultivated meat as part of their pre-market safety review. So there are a few other steps that need to happen for Upside Foods, the company whose product was given the green light, actually come to market with the USDA. However, this is a really, really big first step and demonstrates that, FDA agrees that their cultivated chicken is as safe as conventional chicken. It also opens up other markets that often look to the US to take that first step. So we think it's really exciting and will lead to, a lot of regulatory movement in the coming years.
Yeah, and certainly the market size, Singapore versus the US, is a little bit different. So that'll hopefully be positive. Singapore is a nice place, but a little bit tiny. I wanted to talk about you were talking about the costing and getting up to more of an industrial level. Is it pretty clear that, kind of like in what Tesla had to achieve with manufacturing efficiencies, is it pretty clear that once this is expanded to a larger scale, that the cost should come very close to conventional meat?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes, certainly for plant-based products. And part of the reason I can say that is there are some products that have reached price parity or are committed to doing so. So Just Egg, for example, it's the primary plant-based egg product. dropped its prices by 40% this year, and they're reaching, parity with comparable egg beater types of products, which is how their product is sold. Now, of course, the inflation on the kind of animal protein side has helped that equation. It's something you have to keep in mind. But the efficiency of producing these plant-based products is much higher. And so just kind of thinking through the value chain, it makes a lot of sense that these products would get there. Beyond Meat has committed to undercutting the price of beef by 2024. We've seen companies like Beyond Meat, like Impossible Meat, reduce those costs as they have scaled, and those are some of the larger companies. The reason I say it's more efficient, maybe just to provide a little more context there, is for plant-based meat, it's a really easy story in that right now we are cycling plants through animals to produce our protein. And instead we can feed those plants directly to animals. So a chicken needs 9 calories in to get just 1 calorie out. You're essentially, throwing out 8 plates of pasta. And you're also flying these ingredients and these animals, by the way, all over the world to get through that manufacturing process. So for plants, you can process them directly and then turn them into your meat. You can do this locally. And so it's just a lot more efficient, and we can tell a similar story for these other technologies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So to summarize, one of the points I think is worth highlighting is the supply chain is significantly better because you can basically grow plants anywhere you want with the correct greenhouses, and then it could be right next to this location where they can process it into meat, and then ideally be right next to the population who's consuming it. Right. We've seen this with a few other people on the pod regarding growing vegetables and things of that nature. So I think that's really worth highlighting to people that the efficiencies are massive. And I think probably worth noting that as climate change continues to change certain areas of the country or the world rather, there'll be a lot of places that may not be able to grow traditionally what they were able to before without greenhouses, et cetera. So I want to shift, unless you had any other comments there, I wanted to shift into the topic of carbon emissions, which is probably the reason why people are pushing for this. So could you talk to us a little bit about why this is important? What is the actual impact from a carbon emission standpoint? Would be keen to just kind of go through the basic data there.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually just got back from COP in Egypt. So all these facts are on the tip of my tongue. So appreciate the question. So first of all, why do we need a solution? Animal agriculture accounts for 20% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And a study that was led by Oxford University showed that even if all fossil fuel emissions were eliminated immediately, which, we're working towards it, but of course that's not the case. But even if that were the case, we would still fall short of meeting Paris Climate Agreement targets without a shift away from conventional animal agriculture. And so we view alternative proteins as the most tractable and efficient solution to reducing those animal agricultural emissions that, as I noted, doesn't require consumers to sacrifice. Look at kind of what the potential reduction in greenhouse gas emissions looks like for alternative proteins. If we look at something like plant-based meat, so again, that Impossible Burger, that can cause up to 98% fewer emissions than animal meat, use up to 93% less land, and 99% less water. So not only, are we emitting fewer greenhouse gases, but we are using fewer of these precious resources that are becoming more scarce. Cultivated meat can cause up to 92% fewer emissions than animal meat, use up to 95% less land, and 78% less water. So really, really meaningful differences here, which is why we think this is such a tractable and efficient solution to our emissions and resource use problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's quite helpful to note. I think it's obviously very impactful. The one thing is a bit of a tough question perhaps, but I really want to go into this is I believe it's called Kiss the Ground. There's an older documentary a few years ago that came out that was talking about going away from industrial farming to actually solve the problem of climate change, because obviously the whole reason why we have this issue is that we've got these cattle in kind of, I don't know what you refer to them as, feedstock yards, where they're just kind of there and it's very unnatural, and that's what creates the methane, which is way worse than carbon. And that's why people are so vehement against kind of you having traditional meat and consuming traditional meat. So could you speak to us about if there's also a path, or if people in your space tend to look at that as another solution of going to a more organic type of farming where it's not en masse, you have these massive kind of feedlots, et cetera, that can actually then help the earth instead of depleting the resources from tilling and et cetera, to a more kind of sustainable way, which actually will capture more carbon as well. Could you speak to that a little bit and your perspective on that, and whether or not you believe that is truly a potential solution as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an important question because this conversation it actually came up with an investor I was speaking with earlier today. So it is coming up more and more. So we think alternative proteins are one of the best solution. We haven't heard anything different, but we're very open to these issues that we're talking about. But it's certainly not the only solution. And given the crisis that we're in, we need to pursue as many solutions as possible. The shifting to kind of regenerative, cattle raising, organic farming, that's great. It might have benefits. I can't speak to kind of the science behind that. I've seen some that, say that that's a myth and that there are reasons that doesn't actually work as well because a lot of the studies are based on bison and kind of free roaming ruminants. We can put that aside because this is certainly not my area of expertise. But what I will say is, of course, that requires a whole lot more land if you want to keep producing the same amount of meat in this kind of free-ranging way. And we're already using 77% of our agricultural land for animal agriculture and only producing 1/3 of the protein calories that are eaten from animals. And it's also the leading cause of tropical deforestation. So if we want to continue eating the amount of meat we're eating now, and let alone the 70% or so increase that's expected in demand by 2050, we definitely can't shift all of that to the type of cattle farming you're speaking to, because we would need many, many, many planets to do that. That being said, I think it's reasonable for us to reduce our meat consumption by shifting to alternative proteins and have synergies with this type of regenerative agriculture, which could be allowed by the freeing up of land that we're enabling through the much more efficient production methods of alternative proteins. And just one stat I'd love to provide that I think just shows the power of a small, maybe not a small, moderate shift over. There was a research paper published in Nature that found that substituting just 20%, so 1/5 of ruminant meat consumption with microbial protein, so that fermentation-based protein I was talking about, if we did that by 2050, that would offset any future increases in global pasture area, so perhaps for some of these organic methods, and it would cut annual deforestation and related CO2 emissions roughly in half, and also lower methane emissions. So that's just a 20% shift can enable all of those good things for the planet, and maybe provide some more room for rewilding, first of all, but also for regenerative agriculture.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I appreciate you taking it on. I know it's a tough one, especially because it's kind of the opposite side of this coin that a lot of people, I guess, make the argument for. So I appreciate you taking that. I want to ask, we sort of went over it, but it would be really helpful if you could explain it like you're explaining to a 5-year-old. What is the general summary of how these proteins are made in this kind of new way? What does the feedstock look like? I'm just really curious if you could walk us through very, very basic kind of science of how this works, because I think for a lot of people listening, it's just like, it sounds like you just got these guys with white coats in the lab and they're just like, punching some numbers up and boom, you got something, and it's just really confusing. So could you walk us through that process?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, let's start with plant-based. That's probably the simplest. This is the same way where you can think of it as like baking bread in a lot of ways. So you're essentially, getting your initial crops, let's say that's wheat, and then you are, getting out the things you don't want. So you're, dehusking it. You are separating out often the protein from the fiber and carbohydrates and some other things to get like a protein concentrate or isolate. So something that's higher in protein, so that you can really create that meat from it that has the protein content someone would expect when they're eating a steak or a chicken breast, whatever that might be. And then that is being combined with flavorings and fats, water, is kind of like kneaded into this dough. It's called, the most common technology used is high or low moisture extrusion, but you can think of it as this machine you put these ingredients in that help mix them together, comes out as essentially a dough, and then you can kind of shape into whatever you want, flavor it, cook it, and really those end steps look very similar to what we're doing with animal meat. We're just cutting out kind of that like feeding the plants through the animals, slaughtering them, etc. We're cutting that whole part out and we're just transforming the plants directly into the meat. For fermentation, so it can be done in two different ways to not overcomplicate it, but one can be kind of like dry state fermentation, and I might be getting the term slightly wrong here, but essentially you can grow like mycelium, for example. It's what is like the root structure of mushrooms can be a good way to think about that in these vertical trays. So, akin to maybe vertical farming, you are giving it the nutrients you need in this closed environment, and growing your foodstuffs. For submerged fermentation, for biomass fermentation, or for precision fermentation, this is where we're using those steel tanks. So again, you could think of it as your your local beer brewery, what things look like there. You're feeding the yeast or other microorganisms primarily with some form of glucose as their feedstock, and then they're turning that into either more biomass themselves or producing that target kind of ingredient that you're looking for, depending on which one we're talking about. And then you are, taking it out and purifying it to the extent that you need. So taking out the things you no longer need from the feedstock, water, whatever it is, and getting your end ingredient. And then cultivated meat, I kind of went through that process, but similarly, there is, a range of sugars and nutrients that are being fed to the proteins and come out. The one quick point I want to make, because it's just very cool, is that while glucose for fermentation is the primary feedstock that's being used today, there's a lot of research that's being used, for example, in upcycling like waste streams or side streams of other industrial processes or food processes to use as feedstock. There's some research being done into using gases themselves as feedstock, so like carbon. So you can create like a carbon negative meat, which is really, really cool. These are still earlier stage. This has not been done at commercial stage yet, but these companies have been around for years in some case and are getting traction. And so, the answer to that question could look very different 5 years from now if some of that can be scaled up.
Mm-hmm. That is pretty fascinating. I would be keen to see this. I think this is something I've noticed is there's been a number of people who have touted the kind of really various benefits that you can actually use carbon in a lot of different production of things. So I wouldn't be surprised if that becomes a reality not in the not too distant future. I want to shift over to talking about this really falls into the work you're doing, is what are the really key infrastructure items or aspects missing to be able to make this a reality with this new alternative protein?
Yeah, so unfortunately, the answer is that we need infrastructure really across those three pillars and across the value chain. So that's, everything from more upstream processes like ingredient processing. So I noted like turning your wheat into that wheat concentrate or your soy or your pea or whatever it might be, chickpeas, that type of fractionation technology. There's just not enough capacity for it if we want to really shift into this type of production. So that needs to be expanded meaningfully. We also need end product manufacturing to be expanded. So again, that's maybe using that higher low moisture extrusion for plant-based, or your fermentation tanks for fermentation, your cultivators, which is the term we're using for essentially the equivalent of a fermentation tank and cultivated meat. All of that needs to be built. Again, these are not new technologies, but they're new in the way that they're being applied here. And it's very different to have a technology ready to be used in pharmaceuticals for these like pretty small, scale medicines that are used, on a one-off or maybe continually in the small size for someone's life, versus trying to feed everyone in the world their protein. And as I noted earlier, the costs vary and they'll come down over time as with anything. But right now, you're looking at say 50 to a few $100 million for each of these commercial scale facilities. And we need, thousands of these facilities to meet demand in the coming decades. So that's why it's really, really important for, certainly the private sector to invest, but especially governments to invest, right? Publicly funded research helped drive a solar revolution, right? Solar energy costs came down 85% in the last 10 years. Feel free to correct me if that data is off, but huge reductions in cost. And so we don't have the time at this point. Like we need to address animal agriculture as well. So we think it's really important for governments to fund both open access research as well as infrastructure and commercialization. There is a number that was found in research that was partially funded by the UK government that said that governments have to invest $10 billion a year in both R&D and scaling commercialization to be able to realize these benefits. And they're not only for the planet, right? All the ones we've been talking about, but research also shows it can add up to $1 trillion to the global economy annually and create 10 million jobs by 2050. So quite a few benefits if the governments choose to move in this direction.
Mm-hmm. Would you say there's also, maybe perhaps because the technology is still kind of getting to a point where it's more widely accepted, that there's a gap in the credit facilities to set these things up and things of that nature? Because it sounds like, to my knowledge, most of these are venture funded or private equity funded groups that are really relying on that when they could, in the future, ideally have a credit option.
Yes, that is an excellent point. Absolutely. As you said, a lot of these facilities, when they are kind of first of their kind, naturally are funded with venture capital, venture equity in particular, but that is an incredibly inefficient way to build manufacturing facilities. And so, yes, we need to have options for credit, for project finance. There are increasingly, there are a lot of ways we can do this. There are blended finance structures. There are, government programs that can do this, but the government programs are not yet set up to do that. They tend to be mostly focused on energy. Actually, the DOE wanted to see if they could find a way to fund this with their current language in the regulation, and they just really couldn't find a way to do it. But they recognize it, and so we need to see regulation change to help enable that. And then over time, hopefully on the private sector, there's going to be more proof of concept, and so more revenues, more ways to collateralize that debt that can help open up project finance and markets as well for the industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's always a big part, is the financing. Obviously, a lot of the other climate technologies are doing it through a method of just having a big balance sheet and then doing it like the long term of, hey, we'll pay for the costs up front. We'll just take a share of the revenues or whatever, or the share of the savings, for example. So I think that's an important one people should be aware of. I want to talk about, you mentioned obviously the problems with the infrastructure that we need to fix, but could you talk a little bit more about what GFI is doing to make those advancements?
Yeah, absolutely. So part of the work is on the policy side. As I noted, we are working with governments around the world to help them understand the benefits of these technologies and the potential to help them achieve not just, again, their decarbonization goals, but ensuring a just transition for farmers who, I think you briefly noted earlier, like a lot of those farmers, due to climate change, are not going to be able to continue growing the crops that they have historically. And so there's an opportunity to help transition them to, first of all, like nitrogen fixing crops like oats and legumes and others that will both improve the soil and help diversify their crop yield. So governments can help support, both farmer transition as well as this kind of commercialization and infrastructure build out, and GFI is doing work around the world to help drive that forward. On the private side, and the work that I do with investors, there are a range of ways that we help support investors in understanding the industry, getting educated, getting up to speed. That's through conversations, presentations. We publish a ton of open access research. So for example, like for cultivated meat, we commissioned a techno-economic analysis and a life cycle assessment for the industry. And that's, out there for all investors and governments, for that matter, any stakeholder to take a look at. We also maintain a few different databases to enable deal flow. So we have a fundraising database. This is open access on our website, and investors can go see companies that are currently raising for deals. We've got an investor directory. Investors add themselves to it, and they get inbound deal flow from companies who are raising. So that's a really nice passive way. I include funds. So funds are a really important part of this ecosystem. There are a number of venture funds and growth equity funds that specialize in alternative proteins or dedicate a meaningful portion of their portfolio to it. I maintain a list of that in a quarterly investor newsletter that I write that goes out to 8,000 subscribers. So that's another way to get that information out there. And then for infrastructure specifically, because there are fewer projects out there for reasons we discussed, right? There's not a whole lot of projects that are looking to be funded more so by debt or project finance types of structures. I do maintain a list of those and share them with interested investors. So, I'll give out my email at the end of all this. If anybody has deals that they want, to get in front of investors, whether they're equity deals or infrastructure deals as it relates to alternative proteins, I am here to help make that happen.
Yeah, certainly. We can get to that in the end here. I wanted to go back a little bit because I did want to touch on this topic a little bit more in detail, which is you brought it up, which was the topic of how farmers, there's going to be a lot of farmers potentially not being able to produce what they usually do. Could you talk more about what does the alternative look like for them? And especially, I think it's really important to discuss this because in developing nations, I believe my understanding is that there's a lot of their industry is kind of agriculture related. So could you speak about this and especially how to fit it into this kind of impact related aspect of the ESG and how this is actually impacting them? Because again, they're not going to be able to have the infrastructure or the ability to go and get these funding to build these projects, right? They're going to be reliant on perhaps partnering with companies that need the feedstock. So could you talk broadly about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, I think that farmers deserve our help broadly speaking, right? Whether that's governments or companies to help them transition, and this transition can benefit them because right now, right, the vast majority of crops are these monocrops that, to your point, as the climate changes, as temperatures change, as we have more of these disastrous events, and unfortunately, we've had too many just in the last week globally. Farmers can't just continue growing the one crop that they've relied on. And so the opportunity for, plant-based proteins and as well as these other ones we're talking about is that we can use a wide range of crops. And that will allow farmers to grow, a number of crops that again are better for their land from the diversity, but also many of them are nitrogen fixing, and diversify, their livelihoods by producing these crops. Food crops versus feed crops for animals also tend to have higher margins because, again, it's just a much more efficient cycle. It allows for better margins. So that livelihood could also be much higher quality for those farmers. But to your point, they don't have the savings or the ability or the time. It's an incredibly hard job to understand how to make these transitions. And so, there are a range of nonprofits that are doing this globally, but also we think governments need to play a really big role in enabling this transition because it also meets government goals of decarbonization and supporting their populations. A few other thoughts there. Like one is that we also, for these farmers, we also want to improve their food security. And right now we're feeding, the vast majority of staple crops to animals. So there's some research that shows that if we diversify our protein supply in the way that we've been talking about, it can actually reduce the average cost of staple crops by 10% by 2050. So that can be really important. It can also help reduce the impact of shock. So, there's been a lot of focus on the impact of, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the shortage in staple crops because Ukraine, provides a lot of those crops and grows them. So that the number that's been out there is about, 46 million metric tons of staple grains that we're seeing a shortage of this invasion. Well, we feed 20 times that amount of animals globally. And so again, if we reduce this reliance on animals, we could instead feed those crops directly to people when we have shocks like this, whether they're climate related or geopolitical. And then the last point is that, again, industrial animal agriculture is really bad for ecosystems. And I've been talking a lot about terrestrial animals. So maybe for a moment, I'll talk about seafood, and say that right now, the vast majority of our oceans are overfished or fished at capacity. And that creates a lot of issues for subsistence fishers who rely on fishing to feed themselves and their families. Again, it was just at COP 2 weeks ago and heard from a lot of them directly about they have to go much further out, into the ocean, into their waterways to source the same fish that they used to be able to source much more easily. And that's causing, undue pressures on them. If we shifted to alternative seafood, which is being produced, in these same three ways that we've been talking about, we would, let the ocean ecosystems revive themselves. That supply of fish would increase, and that would make lives a whole lot better for subsistence fishers globally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's fair points to mention. I usually, I come from a farming family. Both my parents were farmers growing up, so I think it's maybe perhaps a specific thing for me. It's very very tiny farms where I'm from in Wisconsin, not big industrial. Obviously some industrial methods, but it's just a very interesting topic to go over. So I appreciate that. I want to talk about, make sure before we run out of time, we mentioned a little bit in this just last part here about ESG and kind of impact. So I wanted to talk about the Alternative Protein ESG reporting framework that has been developed. So could you talk a little bit more about this initiative that you guys have worked on?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe again, I'll just take a step back to make sure we're all kind of on the same page of what is ESG. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And they're essentially a set of factors that investors increasingly have been using to assess their investments and make their decisions on investments, whether that's from a risk management perspective, an impact perspective, or both. Historically, investors just use financial data, which has mandated reporting in the U.S. by the SEC. For ESG, while it's been increasingly used by investors, there has not been government mandated reporting yet. The EU is moving in that direction with their green taxonomy and some of their fund-based categorization and rules. In the US, even the SEC has published a draft on sustainability reporting requirements, but this is not yet implemented, and it's going to take some time if it is. And so in the interim, we've seen a range of NGOs and kind of investor and company consortiums globally come out with reporting standards to support companies in reporting this kind of information to investors and other stakeholders in a way that is, best practice, consistent, comparable, and more, right? It's quite obvious why we wouldn't want everybody, defining things in different ways. But because alternative proteins has come up so quickly into this space, it's increasingly part of portfolios of ESG investors, but there has not been a framework that's been put out, essentially like a guidelines for reporting is all I mean by framework, has not been put out specific to alternative proteins. And so we were starting to see companies and investors try to develop this themselves, which again, doesn't follow best practices, doesn't offer comparability, and is also just not the best use of their time. So GFI, alongside the FAIRR initiative, which is a multi-trillion-dollar investor syndicate or network, I should say, that is also funded by a nonprofit, we came together to develop frameworks for alternative proteins. So we've got one set for specialists, so companies like an Oatly, like an Impossible, that are solely focused on alternative proteins. And then we've got one for what we call diversified companies. So this is your Nestle, your Unilever, your JBS, CPG and meat companies whose core products are clearly not alternative proteins, but they are increasingly getting involved in this space. And this is to allow them to report just on that part of their business. And the hope here is that it allows these companies to highlight the ESG advantages of their products, of their alternative protein products, and help these large companies, really get a handle on how involvement in alternative proteins can help them meet their corporate social responsibility goals, their decarbonization goals. And finally, just to provide a roadmap for best practices. This is a new industry, and we want it, to be as sustainable and just as possible. So this also helps companies, as they build out, try to adopt best practices.
Yeah, certainly. I think it's interesting. I'm interested to see how this is playing out with the ESG reporting, because it's not that you can have one framework that works for everything. I just don't think it's going to work that way. So it's interesting to see that that's been playing out here. I think there'll probably be, I'm assuming, a number of other industries that have to face the same thing in the near future. I want to talk about the types of players that we're seeing get into the space. So I know obviously we've heard about a lot of, I think you mentioned a good number of them, the disruptors, the startups kind of innovating in the space. But are we seeing a lot of effort from as well the conventional players shifting into the space, similar to what we saw with energy, where the big oil and gas companies really saw the writing on the wall and then started moving into the innovation side of things?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great parallel. So yes, we are seeing involvement by the vast majority of CPG companies, meat companies, and increasingly like upstream in the value chain, so ingredient and equipment companies as well. 5 years ago, probably, and I wasn't at GFI at the time, but my understanding is, GFI was proactively going out to these companies to talk to them about this. Some were already involved, so this is certainly not everyone, right? Kellogg has had their Morningstar brand, for example, for a very long time. But generally, it was a more of an outreach-focused engagement. These days, these companies are coming to us and they know they want to be involved. They're just trying to understand how do they most efficiently plug in. And we're seeing, these companies getting involved through launching their own product lines, investing through their venture arms, making acquisitions, joint ventures, a whole lot of partnerships. Like there's a wide range of ways that these companies are getting involved in really creative ways. And, maybe just one example, JBS is the largest meat company in the world. and they made 2 acquisitions last year. One of them perhaps closed this year, but announced at least last year. One was a plant-based company called FAIRR in Europe. It was Europe's 3rd largest plant-based company. And then the other was a cultivated meat company called Biotech Foods based in Spain. And JBS not only acquired them, but committed to investing in total, including the acquisition, $100 million in this initiative, which included a commercial scale, or perhaps not commercial scale, excuse me, but a facility to increase production of cultivated meat, as well as an R&D center in Brazil where JBS is based to advance the science of cultivated meat. So that's just one example. There are many more, but these companies are absolutely involved and involved in quite a number of ways.
Fair enough. I appreciate that. I always think it's interesting to see how long it takes the incumbents in the space to make a change. I think obviously, I think that actually we'll see a lot more of them moving faster now that they're seeing, hey, there's actually a lot of value when you bring in really smart scientists to change things and totally innovate things you never really thought to innovate. So I think it's really fascinating to see how that's playing out. I did want to talk about before we run out of time, the work you do in helping fund research. So could you talk to people who are interested in this? What are the criteria? Who can be involved? What does it typically look like? Just that process would be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is our research grant program, and this is powered by actually a small number of very generous donors who have dedicated capital year after year to funding open access research in alternative proteins. So just for the numbers, we've given out $14 million to date to fund over 82 projects in 17 countries. That, first of all, tells you that this is very much a global effort and it is in no way limited to the US. The goal of this program is to accelerate industry innovation by funding high quality research that's going to build the scientific foundation of alternative proteins. And then the goal is for that research to be used by anyone, whether in the public or private sector. Every year, we select several white spaces to focus our grant making on. And we issue an RFP, a request for proposal, that lays that out, that anyone can then apply for. And again, anybody who's open to conducting open access scientific or technical research can apply for this. So this can be academia, government, industry, nonprofits. It doesn't matter, as long as they're publishing their research either kind of in a peer-reviewed journal in an open access format or making it available on a website. There's a lot more detail around what this might look like and what these individuals agree to when they apply for this program, and would definitely recommend people take a look on our website. I also should note that in addition to those white spaces we identify, we always also accept proposals that just focus on any aspect of improving, organoleptic properties, so sensory properties, the cost or scale up of alternative proteins. So while we focus on those white spaces and to try to direct research to where we think it's the most value, we're open to reviewing kind of any type of proposal that benefits the science and technology of alternative proteins.
Mm-hmm. Very good. I think it's super helpful to know. And one last thing that's just coming to mind, I'd like to ask is for anybody interested in the space and getting into it, what do you typically recommend, especially for people coming into university at the moment, for the type of educational background they should seek? Is it largely biology or chemistry? What are the things that people should do if they want to get into this space?
Yeah, so instead of fully answering your question, I'm going to direct the audience to a resource because I think it's too long of an answer for the time you have left. But we have a initiative called the Alt Protein Program, and this is actually focused on working with students to help build the alternative protein ecosystem. So we have programs at 36 universities that are helping change both the education that is offered to students who are interested in alternative proteins. These are also student groups, so students can learn through the groups themselves, and they work with professors often on research and more. We also have a open access MOOC, so an online course that anyone can take to get involved in alternative proteins. And so I'd recommend that folks take a look on our website. We have a lot of content for students who are interested in getting involved in alternative proteins, can help them think through the path that they want to take in their education. And then we also have these open access resources that they can use to begin that education if what they need isn't offered at their university.
Very good. Well, I think we've covered quite a lot here. I think I really hope this was valuable to a lot of people. So let's wrap things up with any final thoughts and where people can reach you and any other things you want to leave as closing remarks.
Thank you. No, again, first of all, just thank you for the opportunity to come and talk about this. It's an incredibly exciting field, but it is quickly evolving, and I know it's hard for people to keep up. So I hope this was helpful to everybody in the audience, and I'd encourage anybody who wants to reach out to me. My email is sharynm@gfi.org. Sharyn is spelled a little weirdly, so again, maybe we can include that in the show notes, but folks are more than welcome to reach out. One great way to stay on top of the industry and GFI resources is also to sign up for our newsletters. So our website there is gfi.org/newsletters. There's a range of them. You can sign up to the one that makes the most sense to you. And then finally, it is giving season, so I can't quite help myself. If anybody does see value in the work that we're doing, we would love your support. As I noted at the beginning, we're funded entirely by individuals and foundations. And so, go to gfi.org, hit that yellow donate button. We've got some great matching opportunities for the holiday season. And we, appreciate every dollar that comes our way.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you so much for coming on. This has been really, really educational for myself as well. I tend to be a bit skeptical on this specific topic. So I think, I've definitely tried some of these alternative proteins. I can't say it's necessarily I'm rushing back to get them again, but I am open to new things. So I think this has been great, and I'm really excited to see how things continue to develop in the space.
I appreciate that, and all I can say is we're going to work very hard to make sure that in a year from now, if you retry those products, that you will come running back. So we're working on it.
Certainly. Awesome. Great conversation. All right, thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Please let us know what you thought of the show. You can share your thoughts with us over Twitter or reach out to us over the Slack channel. I'm also reachable via LinkedIn. If you do have a specific request, you can also reach me via email, which is in the description, especially if you're a sponsor looking to get on the show. Please feel free to reach out there. And then, as always, we ask that you please do share this with somebody who might find it interesting. I think specifically because this episode was really, really helpful for the alternative protein space, which is a space that I think is very difficult to understand for somebody who's not deep into the space. And I think Sharyn did a good job of helping people who are new to it understand it. So please do consider sharing with somebody you are either trying to convince of the benefits of alternative proteins or whatnot. Definitely share with somebody who might find it interesting, and hopefully we can spread the word about the technology out there. And please, of course, reach out to Sharyn on LinkedIn to learn more about GFI and their work. She also left her email, which we will put in the description as well. And then, especially if you are someone or you know somebody who is looking for funding for an alternative protein project, consider reaching out to GFI to learn more about their grant projects, and especially you can listen to the section where we discuss that and understand if you think you might be a good fit for them. And then if you are listening to us for the first time and joining us for the first time, please, of course, subscribe and turn on notifications. If you enjoyed this episode, we also would really greatly appreciate leaving us a review over on Apple Podcasts. It's extremely helpful for us to get wider distribution of the show, so that'd be great. And then a quick note, our next episode is actually a really fascinating discussion with Graham Stewart, who is a co-founder of Fiber 52, where they are making sustainable cotton. And in the discussion, Graham teaches us how conventional cotton is made and how the formula he refined is able to make it with much less carbon intensity. It was really fabulous to learn the process of making and dyeing cotton and what they're doing to decarbonize this very critical sector and industry. I think it was quite fascinating, some of the things he talked about, and working with a very traditional-minded type of industry and how that they can kind of get innovation going in that space. So really great episode coming up, so stay tuned for that. And again, thank you for tuning into this episode, and we will see you next time on CleanTechies the Podcast.